May I say what a moving experience it is for me to be here. First, because I remember my old boss on those occasions we've seen, and secondly, of course, it is great to be in a country which can actually, one can say about a lot of about I suppose all of the countries formerly part of either the Soviet bloc or more broadly the communist bloc, that as someone who worked for Mrs. Thatcher, I feel I'm among people who benefited from her life and statesmanship, and secondly, I have a share of that. Now, my topic is actually Margaret Thatcher and the special relationship with the United States, and particularly with Ronald Reagan. And if there can be said to be a general popular view of the connection between Margaret Thatcher and the Anglo-American special relationship, almost a caricature, it would be that she was the strongest exponent of the special relationship among post-war prime ministers, sometimes to the point of sacrificing British national interests to the wider alliance and to US interests. Mrs. Thatcher's relationship with Ronald Reagan is sometimes depicted critically in that light. Around the time of the Grenada crisis, for instance, Labour's Dennis Healey famously said, "When President Reagan says jump, Mrs. Thatcher asks, how high?" Friendlier Tory critics, too, such as the historians John Chalmley and Max Hastings, have argued that Mrs. Thatcher placed an undue or even mistaken emphasis on the special relationship and, in consequence, was too ready to support Ronald Reagan on such policies as the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, and the bombing of Libya. Those views are less accepted today than when she was in Downing Street, but they persist. And it must be acknowledged that there is a substratum of truth in them. But they amount to a truth not confined to Margaret Thatcher. All British prime ministers since Winston Churchill, and arguably since Lord Salisbury at the close of the 19th century, have yielded ground to the United States, both when America was a rising power and when it was a dominant one, in what they judged to be either wider alliance interests or overriding long-term national British interests. Mrs. Thatcher was, as we shall see, not exceptional in that regard, but she was franker than most in her general admiration for the United States, and because of her ideological sympathy with Ronald Reagan, she sometimes started out with a more favorable view of his policies than either her foreign secretaries or other European leaders. That said, the popular picture of Thatcherite attitudes is at best wildly exaggerated and at worst simply false. A truer account would be to say, 1, Mrs. Thatcher believed the special relationship to be the single most important element in British foreign policy. 2, that was because it was the best and clearest way of serving British interests and British values worldwide. 3, in her premiership, it did that most of the time. And 4th, she was very different from the Prime Minister to whom she is most often compared when the special relationship is discussed, namely Tony Blair. And 5, the result of their differences is that she left the special relationship in better repair than she found it, and he left it in very much worse so. To justify these bold assertions, let me consider first the nature of the special relationship since the end of the Second World War, when NATO and the other Western institutions were founded to fight the Cold War. Think for a moment to consider what those institutions were. NATO was a multilateral alliance designed to hold the central front in Europe. It succeeded triumphantly. The OECD was a multilateral economic alliance to oversee the revival of Western European economies. It succeeded triumphantly. The European Union was not a Cold War institution, but it had strong American support in creating a more integrated Europe. Until recently, it succeeded quite remarkably too. All of these bodies, however, were Eurocentric. They were detached from the anti-communist struggle in the rest of the world. Often their leaders were hostile or indifferent to US struggles against communism elsewhere, which, after 1968, European leaders often modishly described as imperialism. By contrast, the special relationship was a worldwide enterprise, though an informal one. The reality, that was the case when, from 1948 to the arrival of Mrs. Thatcher in Downing Street. The special relationship had been left in good hands by James Callaghan, who was so pro-American that he was widely suspected as being the CIA's man in the House of Commons. And though Jimmy Carter and Mrs. Thatcher would never be soulmates, they helped each other through the crises that came their joint way. She gave him strong public support over the Iranian hostages issue, and she was stronger than other Europeans in backing his sanctions on the Soviets over Afghanistan. But that's not saying a great deal. But the degree of sympathy and mutual interest took a great leap when both Thatcher and Reagan were securely in place as heads of government in 1981. The solidarity of leadership between the two was rooted in three facts. First, Mrs. Thatcher was strongly pro-American. She had visited the United States in the 1960s as part of a distinguished visitors program run by the State Department, and she'd been greatly impressed by the technical efficiency of American industry and by the dynamism of American society. That was the kind of enterprising society she wanted Britain to become, and she felt at home in it. Second, Reagan himself was pro-British in a somewhat different way. He had a slightly sentimental view of Britain as a land of kind hearts and coronets. But he had also come to political maturity at the time when the British were fighting gallantly for their lives in 1940. That left its mark. He saw the British as tough underneath the surface gentility. Third, both Reagan and Thatcher had recognized at their first meeting in 1975, just 1 month after she was elected Tory leader, that they were ideologically close. They would differ on some points, but they expected to be in general agreement on the great issues of the day, particularly the Cold War and the revival of capitalism. The result of these three factors was that the institutions of the special relationship, the military interoperability, the presence of the CIA London station chief at meetings of the British Joint Intelligence Committee, the worldwide electronic system called Echelon, and all the, essentially an intelligence network, and all the habits of cooperation between the two governments, these were suddenly infused with a new and potent enthusiasm. One might almost say there were two special relationships, the government-to-government one and this personal relationship between president and prime minister, and that strengthened the other two. Neither of these relationships was without tensions. Both developed over time. It is well known that Mrs. Thatcher occasionally spoke disparagingly of President Reagan's intelligence in the early days. Nico Henderson, Norman Lamont, and others have quoted her to this effect. But those quotes, I believe, come from the first few years or so of their joint leadership. Her view of Reagan evolved considerably. She was initially contemptuous in private of the president's apparently detached and lazy leadership. By her own scholarship girl standards, the president seemed quite simply not to be in command of his brief. When he succeeded, all the same, she was somewhat baffled. And when his success happened repeatedly, she had to reassess her first judgment and to recognize that he was exercising a different kind of political leadership from the one she had come to exercise in a parliamentary context. I believe her final judgment, this is from her memoirs, I believe her final judgment, it was easy for lesser men to underestimate Ronald Reagan, was actually a disguised admission of her own error in that. Her mature view of Reagan and of their relationship was probably best expressed by her foreign policy advisor, Sir Percy Craddock, who contrasted the two leaders as follows: the bossy, intrusive Englishwoman, lecturing and hectoring, hyperactive, obsessively concerned with details, and the lazy, sunny Irish ex-actor, his mind operating mainly in the instinctive mode, happy to delegate and over-delegate, hazy about most of his briefs, but with certain stubbornly held principles, a natural warmth, and an extraordinary ability to communicate with his constituents, the voters. As Sir Percy went on to say, these different personalities complemented each other very well. They were not oil and water, but oil and vinegar. No prizes for guessing who was which. As for the government-to-government relationship, this was one between states, and states inevitably have different interests, especially when they are acting in a worldwide context. When we stand back from the year 1981 to 1989, however, we can see that the cooperation between these two people led to marked historical changes for the better. I will cite what I believe to be their two signal achievements. First, the peaceful end of the Cold War that enabled millions of people to live free lives, as here. Second, spreading throughout the world a new and more vibrant information-based capitalism that led to billions of people, especially in Asia, leading more prosperous and more hopeful lives. My judgment is that Reagan was principally responsible for the first achievement, Mrs. Thatcher for the second. Others may take a different view. But this leads naturally into a discussion of the disputes that occurred between both of them during their 8 years of cooperation and achievement. All those who have written extensively on the Reagan-Thatcher relationship, starting with Jeffrey Smith in his 1991 book, which relied on people who at that time were still, major figures still active in politics, have acknowledged that there were serious disputes between the two principals. They were, in short order, the Falklands War, the Grenada crisis, the Soviet gas pipeline dispute, the US budget deficit, the Strategic Defense Initiative, and what Mrs. Thatcher saw as Reagan's willingness to trade away the West's nuclear deterrent at the Reykjavik summit with Mikhail Gorbachev. One should point out that their disputes, however, were conducted in a calculatedly careful way. Mrs. Thatcher never pulled her punches in private about her opposition to Reagan on those issues, but she had an artful way of doing this. She would complain, look across the table, and focus on one of his aides, and she would say, Jim, I just can't see why you're doing this, while Reagan was sitting right next to the man. This meant that she could be tough substantially without forcing a personal confrontation. But complain she would and did forcefully, as people like Richard Pearl have ruefully confirmed. I think, by the way, Reagan knew what she was doing and kind of liked it. Secondly, she was usually more circumspect in public, though on the gas pipeline and Grenada, she was highly critical in public too. Indeed, she passed a bill prohibiting British companies from observing US sanctions. 3, when Reagan was in trouble at home, she pulled her punches over, for example, the US budget, over Irangate, and even stepped out to give him strong political and rhetorical support. In an interview during Irangate with CBS's Leslie Stahl, she told the interviewer not to be so gloomy since she lived in a great country with a great president. 4, she lost some battles, but she won some she shouldn't have won, given the disproportion of power between the White House and number 10 Downing Street. On one famous occasion, she waited for the last moment of her discussion, which had gone well, with Reagan, to produce a list from her handbag and say, "Oh, arms for Argentina? You won't, will you, Ronnie?" His aides had prepared him to say, "I'm afraid, Margaret, we are going to be doing that." But he didn't want to prejudice the success of the meeting so far, and so he replied, "Of course not." In short, Mrs. Thatcher went beyond what was necessary in pursuing the policies that reflected either joint US-UK interests or wider alliance interests, or the president's political standings. She fought fiercely for British interests when they were ignored or resisted by the US or the president. She won a larger percentage of those battles because she was such a stout friend on most things, and she generally exercised such a strong influence on the administration that, as Jeffrey Smith points out in his book, senior officials and departments would often seek her support on some issue because they found it might help them to convince the president. No other statesman, not even Churchill, has exercised such influence on the internal workings of the US government. Mrs. Thatcher, in this success, can be compared to another prime minister who is often seen, especially by Americans, as a paragon of the special relationship, namely Tony Blair. Obviously, there are many points of similarity between both prime ministers and how they treated the US relationship. Yet it's worth pointing out that when she left office, the special relationship was stronger than before, whereas when he left office, it was seriously weaker. British opinion was more anti-American, and the consensus at the top of politics was that Britain should detach herself as far as possible from American interventionism. Why? Very simply, Mrs. Thatcher always fought for British interests, and she defended her foreign policy in those terms. She was not averse to citing international law and other justifications in, for example, the Falklands War. But she made it clear that the purpose of the task force was to free British citizens and to recover British territory. By contrast, in the Iraq War, the equivalent to Mrs. Thatcher's Falkland, Blair almost never defended his policy in terms of patriotism and the national interest. Instead, he presented two main justifications: our obligations to the international community and international law, and the need to buttress our alliance with the United States. Thus, the few conditions he laid down for British participation in the US effort reflected not British interests, but progressive supranationalist opinion, such as pressing Israel to make concessions to the Palestinians or going to the UN Security Council for stronger legal backing. But unless there was either British interests or obligation involved in Iraq, and historically, of course, there was both. Effectively, the British founded Iraq after the First World War. Most British people, however, saw, unless there was interest or obligation, most British people would see little justification for sending British troops in harm's way. To justify invading Iraq because it would please America might be enough to justify an early and easy victory, but it could not keep public support for a long and uncertain anti-guerrilla campaign there. And in practice, it proved to be, in the end, an excellent strategy for weakening the special relationship. I'm no doubt that Blair regretted that, but the special relationships, in his view, always came second to Britain's commitment to the European Union in his list of priorities. Whenever there was a clash between the two, as for instance over the EU's plans to develop an independent European defence structure, threatening NATO with the duplication and diversion of scarce military resources, he invariably sided with the EU. Indeed, he exploited his credit with the United States, gained by his support in the Gulf War, to persuade the Bush administration to go along with Brussels. Maybe we should not be surprised. No conceivable reform could have made Blair eligible to be President of the United States, but his name had been floated time to time as a contender to be Europe's first president. Whatever Blair's motives, he left the special relationship weaker, and Margaret Thatcher left it stronger. And those different outcomes arise more or less directly from their different visions of what the special relationship represented. She saw it as an extension of British patriotism to a wider but still natural set of loyalties in the English-speaking world. Blair saw it as a useful historical relationship, but a fading competitor to the wider patriotism of the European nation still striving to be born. And that is why, at the end of the day, she proved to be a much better guardian of British interests in both those relationships. Thank you.